you very much for joining back in. My name is Fonny. In my channel, I talk about my houseplant and Hoyas and also share my experience with you in my plant journey in my little plant room. In today's video, I would like to do something similar to what Kaylee Ellen and Alicia has done. It's about plant index. And today I want to talk about Hoya as well. And similar to what Alicia has done is the Hoya difficulty index. I have selected 10 plants that I have experienced in the past year that I can share a little bit of my experience of how difficult I found they are. So these 10 houseplant, some of them I have not shown you in other videos, so you can stay tuned for that one. And I also have some plants that I have showed you in my other videos. However, I want to focus on 4 areas so that I can make sure that there are some new information that you can get from this video. I will analyze their difficulty in terms of humidity requirement, the growth rate, the soil substrate sensitivity, and also how difficult they are to ship. So starting from the first one, it is Hoya Patella. I found this one to be the hardest out of the 10. First of all, the humidity. This plant really needs high humidity to keep it alive. I'm not saying to keep it happy, because keeping it happy takes a lot more. So let's start with humidity, which is the fundamental part that to keep this plant alive is it really needs to be around maybe 75 to 90% of humidity. The reason why I say that is because it has really thin leaf texture, and also it's relatively hairy as well. So what makes it to be extra difficult? It is because it has wooden thin stem, which is very easy to be rotten if the soil substrate is too moist. Which brings to another part is the soil substrate sensitivity. Because of the nature of the wooden stem, but it also really thin, you can't really have the soil substrate to be too moist. But at the same time, because it needs high humidity on the leaf, you really need to strike a balance between the two. So my experience, if you remember, I can show you on the side, is I have imported the Hoya Patella, and I also showed a 1-month update with you guys. What I have seen in that video is it seems growing pretty well. It has pushed out multiple new growth points, and also in the sphagnum moss, it also pushed out a lot of root. Now, this is the part that I want to talk about in the soil substrate situation. I really don't want you to touch the root or take it out from the existing environment. What I did in that video is I took it out from the prop box for probably 1 hour, and then I also unwrapped the root from the sphagnum moss and repotted it into the Lithophytica pond. What happened is those cuttings all died, and I am sorry to say that it probably is because of me. And what I have learned from that story is Hoya Patella has very sensitive root because it's so thin. It dried out easily, but at the same time, it also could rot easily because it doesn't really have too much room for it to suck up a lot of water. And it also doesn't have a lot of room for it to use up all of the water. So the soil substrate is very important to keep just in the moist level, but not damp. And then move on to the growth rate. The growth rate is moderate, but it depends on how mature and healthy the roots are. From my experience, the first trial, unfortunately, it doesn't work. However, I do have success after 1 month in addition, which is fast forward to today now. Even though the existing growth point died off, it pushed out new growth point. It pushed out an entire new vine. What I have done here is that I kept it in the same environment, around 90% humidity. I keep it warm, I have extra light. I just keep it there, I do not touch it, and I do not really take it out and look at it at all. I just keep it there. So the growth rate is moderate when the roots are fully developed, but it takes time for the root to be developed, and then it will push out new growth. So then I move on to the last point, the difficulty in shipping. Because the Hoya itself is very sensitive to everything else, sensitive to humidity, sensitive to the soil substrate, you really can't expect to have a very healthy plant to be delivered to you. Either you are importing or you are shipping it from your local nursery. So I think what you really can expect for Hoya Patella is to reroot it from day one and do not touch the root until you are super certain that it is very mature. Probably not during the winter time. Maybe you should wait until spring hits. So that's my recommendation. Then we move on to the second most difficult, is Hoya Picta. If you remember Hoya Picta, it is included in my first import, and good news is it is still alive. The bad news is it hasn't really grown that much. For Hoya Picta, first of all, humidity. I don't really think it needs too much humidity actually, because the leaf itself is quite thick, quite succulent, even though it's very small. So humidity, I don't think you need to worry too much about that. But move on to the growth point. I think it grows super slow. It has tried to push out a couple of times new leaf for under my condition, but all of them eventually turned brown and died. What I anticipate is that my environment is too humid. I kept it in the prop box. It was too humid, so it just have too much condense of water on the leaf. So it just have some weird patch on the new leaf growth. So in that experience, it tells me you shouldn't keep it in too humid environment. Maybe around 50 should be okay. And so the growth point conclusion is it grows relatively slow. And then we move on to the soil substrate sensitivity. The plant has extremely thin stem. Now, this, as I mentioned about Hoya Patella, thin stem normally is quite difficult to root. It is because it is so easy to rot if you put it in the soil substrate that is too damp. But how could you make sure that the soil substrate is not too damp, but it's moist enough? Now, this is the difficult part, because you need to have that sweet spot to make sure that the soil substrate is not too damp, but only moist. So the sensitivity is relatively high, I would say. So what I will do for Hoya Picta is to keep it in a small container, so then it won't have too much soil substrate that has too much dampness that can't evaporate as soon as possible. So I'll keep it in a smaller pot, and at the same time, probably don't need to keep it in the prop box, but make sure that you have something warm underneath. You either have a heat mat or some areas in your home that is around 25 plus degrees Celsius. So I think that will be okay. And then in terms of the shipment, because of its I would say because it is very thin in the stem, it's difficult to store a lot of water in the stem. So it is difficult to ship, but because the leaf is quite succulent, it could potentially stock up enough water to keep it alive during the shipment. So what you need to do for Hoya Picta really is you need to reroot it. And don't be afraid to cut it into different pieces, so then you can increase the chance of the stem being rooted. Then we move on to the third most difficult Hoya. It is Hoya Panchoi. It is an interesting one because if you remember, I have a growth update in my other video that you can check out. It looks very similar to Hoya Heuschkeliana. Even though it looks so similar to Hoya Heuschkeliana, it is so much more difficult than Hoya Heuschkeliana. For Hoya Panchoi, my problem is it rots so easily. We can start with the first analyzed point, the humidity. I don't think Hoya Panchoi needs very high humidity, because too high of a humidity, you will find some patches on the leaf because of the condensation of the water that has stayed on the leaf that can't be evaporated. And second of all, because Hoya Panchoi has very thin stem, not as thin as Hoya Picta, but thin enough to be rotten inside a damp soil substrate. Because of that, I have that problem. I believe it's because of that. So I don't think it needs high humidity, but when it comes to the sensitivity to in the soil substrate is because of the thin stem nature, similar to Hoya Picta, you should keep it in a relatively smaller container, so then it won't rot its stem from always constantly damp soil substrate. So it is quite sensitive to the soil substrate. And then for the growth rate, it grows really slow as well. I can show you in the reference point. I saw there are 2 new leaf probably a week ago. Took it out from my prop box, took a picture, and then put it back. After 1 day, the 2 new leaves dropped. And it's probably because of me, which is really upsetting. But I also know that it does not like to be moved around. So that's probably one lesson you can learn as well. So then we move on to the 4th one, is the shipping difficulty. Interesting enough, I think it shipped very well. If you reference to my unboxing video, it was in the mail for probably 8 days. It arrived super healthy. It almost like it hasn't gone through a photosanitary certification process, but it has. So I think it shipped very easily. The condition came in really, really well, but you really need to pay more attention when you're rerouting it. Because of the thin stem nature, it's very sensitive to the moisture level in the soil substrate. Then we move on to the 4th difficult Hoya, is Hoya Sigillatis. I have shown you in my anti-orchid Hoya haul. In that experience, I found Sigillatis to be very sensitive Hoya. We can start with the humidity. It does need higher humidity because of the thin leaf nature, but at the same time it has crazy thin stem as well. It's almost like Hoya Picta's stem, but the leaf itself is much larger than Hoya Picta. So what I found for Hoya Sigillatis is you need to give it higher humidity, probably say 60 to 70%. I have placed my Hoya Sigillatis next to a humidifier. So in that scenario, in my case, it worked. And then we move on to the growth rate. Probably because I never put it in a prop box. I never give it additional heat nor additional light during the winter time. I haven't really seen any growth in the foliage, but I have seen a lot of growth in the root. So the growth rate on the leaf, I believe it needs to have enough root and also enough sun for it to grow out new foliage. So the growth rate is relatively low. Then we move on to the soil substrate sensitivity. Because it has very thin stem, again, same to Hoya Picta, same to Hoya Panchoi, do not have a too damp soil substrate. Recommended to have a smaller container first, so then the soil substrate could evaporate its extra dampness first. So yeah, lastly is the difficulty in shipping. It is difficult in shipping, unfortunately, because of the thin stem. Even it is also a larger foliage, make it extra difficult to ship. You can assume that all of the root will come dead, and you need to reroot it. I have tried to reroot it in water. It died from rot. It didn't push out any root growth, but I put it directly to pon as well. So in that specimen, it rethrived back. It took quite a long time to rethrive back, I would say. Maybe after 2 months, I finally see that there are growth in the root. The 5th one is Hoya Lithophytica. I have another video showing step by step how to solve stem rot problem, walking you through how I identify it, what kind of treatment I have done, and also what are the results. So if you unfortunately have encountered that situation, you can refer to that video and hopefully you will find that helpful. But in today's video, I will focus on the 4 characteristics that I can explain on this particular Hoya. With regard to humidity, Hoya Lithophytica is extremely thin. Out of all of the Hoya I'm explaining you today, it has the thinnest leaf and the smallest foliage. So because of this nature, it really likes to be surrounded in high humidity environment. I always put it in my prop box around, I would say 85 to 90+% humidity. And under that environment, one thing that you need to be very careful is how damp is the soil substrate. Naturally, we go to the second point, which is the sensitivity of the soil substrate dampness. Now, if you look at Hoya Lithophytica, it actually has thicker stem compared to the first 3, but it has a very thin, small leaf, which means that potentially it doesn't need as much water. So that makes it very easy to have stem rot. And that's the reason why I created another video, how to solve your stem rot problem. And because of that, it is sensitive to the moisture level in the soil substrate. Same recommendation is to keep it first in a smaller container when it has grown enough root that can suck up all of the water inside the soil substrate. Then you can move it up to a bigger pot size. So that's the second part. And then for the growth rate, it is interesting because it grows really fast. If you remember in my 1-month growth update video, I explained you that Hoya Lithophytica grows super fast. Actually, it starts putting out air root. Probably in the 3rd or 4th day, I have put it in the juice pond completely without any root, just from a cutting. And it pushed out a lot of new leaf throughout the time until today. So the growth rate is really fast because I think it is very easy for it to push out air root, and the air root can absorb the humidity from the air, which will be enough for new leaf to grow. That's the reason why you found a lot of new growth in my reference video. Then we move on to shipping difficulty. For Hoya Lithophytica, it has a relatively thicker stem, even though the leaf itself is very thin and small. Because the stem is very thick, it actually can stock up enough water to supply to the leaf during the shipment. So you could anticipate that the shipment shouldn't be too difficult. And in addition, even though if the leaf all dropped off, this is what I've experienced as well. Because the stem is relatively thick, it is still alive upon arrival. What you could do is that just propagate the stem itself as well. Because as long as the stem is alive, it potentially will push out air root, and the air root can absorb humidity from the air in addition to soil substrate. And even if the soil substrate rotten the stem itself, the air root that has grown in the stem could potentially still sustain the cutting itself. That's why I conclude that the shipping difficulty is relatively low for Hoya Lithophytica. The 6th one is Hoya Kanyakumariana. This Hoya, with regard to humidity, it doesn't need too high the humidity. In my experience, I just put it in the room temperature and room humidity with an extra small humidifier next to it. So the humidity is around 35 to 45%, and it's still okay, it's still living. I'm not saying that it is thriving because there's no extra light that I have provided, but it is alive and it also has pushed out root. So humidity, it doesn't need too much. When it comes to the soil substrate sensitivity, because the stem is relatively thicker, even though the leaf itself is very small and thin, it doesn't really mind to have a little bit extra in the in humidity within the soil substrate. Now, I'm not talking about watery and super damp soil substrate. I'm talking about keeping it in a higher part in humidity in the soil substrate. That should be okay. But what I found for Hoya Kanyakumariana is it grows extremely slow. I am not sure if it's because now it is winter, which I think it is one of the reasons. It is super slow in growing. It has very small cardboardy texture in the leaf. Maybe because of that, leaves doesn't push out as easy, but it grows very slow. From my experience, I have it for like half a year or maybe 4 or 5 months now. I haven't seen any new leaf grown, so wish me luck on that. And then last part is the shipping. It shipped pretty okay, I would say. Because the wooden stem is quite thick, it could stock up some water to sustain the leaf itself, and also because the leaves itself are very hard and cardboardy, it seems like it can stock up relatively more moisture or water as well. So when I received it, it doesn't have extremely amount of leaf drop. So I think it shipped okay. So I would say for this plant, everything is moderate. Moderate humidity, moderate difficulty in soil substrate sensitivity, slow growing, and moderate difficulty in shipping. The 7th one is Hoya Curtisii. Now, this one is one of the first Hoya that I have obtained since I start collecting Hoyas, starting with the humidity. I don't think it requires a significant high humidity. I would say around 45 to 50% would be good, and that's what I have kept it in my room environment. And move on to the sensitivity of the soil substrate. I found it quite easy to wrinkle. Even though the leaf it's relatively thicker, not as thick as say Fuaensis, but it is relatively thicker compared to say Lithophytica. But it requires quite a lot of water. Maybe it is because it has quite a lot of foliage, like there's a lot of small tiny Curtisii leaf in one small pot. It requires more water. My Curtisii often dry up and become paper thin. So what I found is that it's easier for me to keep it in a relatively moist substrate, so then it can constantly be moist in the roots. Ever since that I changed it to Lithophytica and kept it always moist, it never really wrinkled. And move on to the growth rate. The growth rate is quite slow actually. Even though the leaf itself is really small, it's supposed to grow easier and quicker than the bigger leaf ones. But for Hoya Curtisii, I haven't spotted new growth until 3 or 4 months after I have obtained the Curtisii. What I anticipate is that it needs to have mature root, and then it will grow and push out new leaves. But as long as it pushed out new leaves, it will constantly push out new leaf. So you really need to reach to that particular point, then it will start growing quite fast. Lastly, the shipping. Because this one I bought it in the local nursery, I can't really tell my experience with the shipping from another country or shipping in the mail. But what I would anticipate, it has a lot of air roots in the stem, which means that it could absorb moisture from the air much easier than the stem that doesn't have air roots. So I think because of the stem itself is a little bit thicker, and also the leaves are relatively more succulent, it shouldn't be too difficult to ship in the mail. Then we move on to the 8th one, is Hoya Mathilde. It is also one of the Hoyas that I obtained in the very beginning of my Hoya collection time. So starting with humidity, Hoya Mathilde is very friendly when it comes to humidity. I don't think you need to worry too much about, you need to give it extra humidity. I would say 30 to 45% would be enough. The reason is because the leaf itself is relatively thick, even though it's smaller in size, but because of the thickness and also relatively thicker stem, it should have enough water stored in both the leaf and the stem. So it doesn't need extra humidity in the air to keep it happy. Then we move on to the soil substrate sensitivity. This is really interesting example that I can give you. When I first obtained it, I bought it from a local nursery, but I have it shipped to my home. It potentially is an import from Thailand. It is included in a cocoa husk. Because of that, it doesn't really have moisture in the roots. So when I received the plant, all of the leaves are super wrinkly and almost like it's a dead plant. At the time, I made up my mind. I removed it from the cocoa husk and then I repotted it in Lechuza pond. I am extremely happy with the result after I have done that. Even though that was the first time for me, removing it from a cocoa husk, pretty much ripping off all of the existing root and have it bare root and plug it in to Lechuza pond. So at that time, what I found is that it is not very sensitive to more moist environment, because look, when you have cocoa husk, which is extremely airy and really dry, I would say, most of the time, and compared to the Lechuza pond, which is mostly moist all of the time. In this transition, I didn't really found any problem, but only a good result is that the plant finally pushed out tendrils after tendrils after tendrils. It actually reacted to more moist substrate in a positive way. So I found this one to be difficult. That's why I put it in this category. It is because it takes time for it to grow. And because of this low growing condition, you could think that it's more difficult. At least that's my impression in the beginning. It never really grow and it's wrinkly, and then I feel like I'm going to lose that plant. But at that moment, I was like, okay, do it now or never. And then I have transitioned it from cocoa husk to the Lechuza pond. So that's the conclusion for the growth rate. The growth rate is relatively slow until it has developed enough root. It will start push out new tendrils and new leaf. And once that point has hit, it grows pretty fast. But you need to be patient because it's not a fast grower for me in the first, say, 5 months. But after I have transitioned it, and also after the root has developed in a good way, it pushed out leaf constantly. And I also have a couple of peduncles. Not expecting it to grow now because it's pretty dark still, but it has multiple peduncles grown in the tendrils. So last but not least, the shipping difficulty. I don't think it's difficult to ship because the stem is relatively thick. Even the leaf, it's small, it is relatively thicker as well. It can have enough water stored up within the plant itself during the shipment. So I think it would be quite easy to ship for Hoya Mathilde. Then we move on to the second last, that is Hoya Serpens. Hoya Serpens, to me, I found it not extremely difficult, but I do think that it needs extra care and attention. We can explain starting from the humidity requirement. Because of the leaf itself is relatively small and also the stem is a green stem, it actually needs extra humidity in the air to make the plant be happy. Different from Hoya Mathilde. Hoya Mathilde has a relatively wooden stem, and also it is much thicker in the leaf itself. It doesn't really need extra humidity in the air to sustain the plant to make it happy. So Hoya Serpens does, need extra care in that perspective. And when we move on to the soil substrate sensitivity, now because of the nature of the leaf and also the stem, it does need extra moisture in the soil substrate to keep it plumped up most of the time. For me, what I find it to be the most difficult part is you really need to be on top of the watering, because Serpens has very small leaf size. It doesn't have too high of a tolerance or too high of a gap of underwatering, because if you underwater it, it will quickly shrink up, and then it will become paper thin and the entire tendril could just dry out and die. That is because the tendril is very thin, and also the leaf itself is very thin as well. So it doesn't really tolerate to be underwatered too much. And then when we move on to the growth rate, interestingly, the growth rate is extremely fast. I remember when I received this one, it is potted in soil, and I received it in late summertime. It started pushing new growth in the second week, so it is very quick. What I anticipate is it is a very well-rooted plant, and it has acclimated to my environment well and quickly. And once it pushed out new growth, it just constantly pushing out new growth. And if you can see from my reference video, it is still growing in wintertime, and there are multiple new leaves. It is super cute, it is super tiny. It's just a very prolific grower. However, it does take extra care when you are having a Hoya Serpens. And when it comes to the shipping, I would say it could be quite difficult to ship if you are shipping bare root, because it is very thin in the leaf. It doesn't have a lot of storage of water, extremely thin in the stem, doesn't have a lot of storage of water either. So I think it's better for you to buy it in springtime, so then at the time when you received the plant, it will have enough warmth, enough sunlight, and also high humidity in the air to re-thrive back. So I will recommend you to put it in a prop box if you received it in the mail in this time. Then we move on to the last Hoya for today. It is Hoya Heuschkeliana Variegated. I didn't put this one in a high rank. It is because I find it not extremely difficult to keep alive, but you do need extra care tip to keep it happy. So let's start with the first characteristic, which is humidity requirement. Similar to Hoya Heuschkeliana non-variegated, it doesn't really need extra humidity. But when it comes to light, that is something in addition I would like to explain compared to other ones, because this one is the only variegated Hoya of today. Because for Hoya Heuschkeliana variegated, it mostly have variegated leaves, which means that the green portion of the plant is very limited. The green portion has chlorophyll, and only areas that has chlorophyll can perform photosynthesis. That makes this plant to be a little bit difficult to keep if you are keeping it in a darker area. So if you want this plant to be happy, keep it in a relatively brighter location would be beneficial. Then we move on to the second point that we're going to discuss is the soil substrate sensitivity. For this plant, it is relatively thinner in the leaf foliage, and the stem itself it's moderate. It's not extremely thin, but it is not extremely thick either. So for the soil moisture, I have noticed that on YouTube a lot of people have difficulty in keeping Hoya Heuschkeliana, and sometimes people say that it just died and it never really pushed out new growth and it wrinkles a lot. What I found for smaller leaf Hoya, regardless which type, I found smaller leaves Hoya prefer to have a moist soil substrate. So what I have done for my Heuschkeliana variegated, I water it quite often. Of course, not talking about keeping it damped, but I keep it in a relatively smaller pot, and also I water it quite often. For example, now in winter time, I water it every week. So I will make sure that the soil substrate will never go bone dry. Yeah, for this one is one of the few that I keep it still in soil, because I received it in soil, so I don't really need to reroot it because it's already rooted in soil. So in that perspective, I don't want to interrupt it. I just want to wait until springtime to repot it in the chooser pond. But what I did is I keep it moist most of the time. And actually a couple of days ago, I found that the leaf has wrinkled a little bit because I haven't watered it for say 10 days. I just want to experiment and see what are the tolerant rate of the plant, so then I can see, okay, I don't want to overwater it, but I also want to make sure that the plant itself is moist enough. So after 10 days not watering the plant, the leaf has wrinkled a little bit. And then I watered it, and after around 2 days, the leaf plumped back to the original condition. So that tells me that the plant really reacts to the moisture level of the soil substrate, and watering it every 5 days seems to be happy for the plant. Then we'll move on to the growth rate. I am happy with the growth rate actually. If you can refer to my video, even now in wintertime, it is still constantly pushing out new leaf. It's for sure not as quick as in the spring and summer season, but it is still pushing out new growth, and the new growth is really adorable. It is like white, pinkish, green color. It's just very mesmerizing, I would say, for the tiny cute little leaf. So it grows pretty well as long as it has enough moisture in the soil substrate, even though it doesn't have additional light, and now it doesn't really have a lot of light in winter time. It still continue pushing out new growth. So I would say the growth rate is pretty high. And then we move on to the shipping. For this one, I believe it should be okay to ship. Probably not as easy as Hoya Heuschkeliana non-variegated, because of the leaf itself is very variegated for the variegated version. So it could be a little bit more difficult than the non-variegated one, but based on the thickness of the leaf and also the thickness of the stem, I believe it shouldn't be too difficult to ship. Thank you very much for staying until now. I hope you enjoyed the content. I know that today's video is relatively longer, but I want to show you the top 10 most difficult Hoyas that I have experienced. And not just talking about the 4 characteristics, but I also want to show you how I try to tackle the situation, and hopefully you will find it helpful that you can also apply to the more difficult Hoya that you have. So if you are interested in this type of videos, feel free to subscribe to my channel, and I also have an Instagram account that I created recently where I will post pictures of my plants. Well, until next time, I hope everyone is staying safe and have a great day. Bye!